The veil she wore hid the bruises for 20 years. A Lakota chief lifted it and wept with her. The deer hide is still folded the same way she left it. Bottom corner tucked under. A hand's width of beadwork showing, blue and white, the color of sky just after thunder. I haven't unfolded it in 3 winters. I sit with it in my lap sometimes, the way you sit with something that has no more words left in it but you can't put it on a shelf either. I am going to try to tell you this the right way. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I was chief of our band for 19 years. Before that I rode with my father. Before that I was a boy who thought bravery was a thing you wore on your chest like paint. I know better now. I know it's a thing that costs you something first. You cannot have it free. What I am telling you happened over 2 seasons, though it started 20 years before that with a wrong I didn't know was being done, to a woman I had not yet met, by a man I should have stopped sooner. That's a burden I carry. I'll carry it to the ground. But this story is not about the weight. It's about what happened when she finally put hers down, and what that did to a man like me who had long since stopped expecting to feel anything that's soft again. So let me back up. The winter I turned 53, my band had moved camp twice in 4 months. The army kept pushing west. Not fast, they moved like a slow fever. You could almost not feel it happening, but each time we woke up the horizon had shifted. Our hunting ground thinned. The young men were angry in the way young men get when there is nothing good to do with the anger. I kept peace between them and the elders, kept them fed, kept them moving before trouble found us. But I was tired, not the tired of a long ride, the other kind. My wife Winona had died 6 years before that winter. Fever. 3 days and then she was gone, and I remember sitting outside our tipi listening to the horses and thinking, so that's how it is. So that's how fast. She had been beside me for 22 years, half my life. I didn't know how to eat without her across from me. I didn't know how to sleep lying flat. I slept sitting up for almost a year, my back against a willow frame, because lying down felt too much like something I had to do alone. People say a chief doesn't grieve the same as other men, that his grief is private and he carries it without showing. They're right mostly. I carried it without showing for 6 years, but it was still there. It doesn't go away. It just gets quiet and you mistake quiet for gone, and then something opens a door and there it is again, the same size it always was. What opened the door was her. Her name was Sira Voss. She came into our camp on a November morning with a white trader named Aldous Bright who owed 2 of our warriors a debt in horses. He brought 4 horses and her. Not as trade, she rode and free, or so she seemed. But I watched her get down from that horse, and I saw the way she looked at the ground when she dismounted, the way she stepped slightly to the side of where Bright was standing without seeming to do it on purpose. Small things. A man who has lived long enough reads small things. She was not young, maybe 45. German or Dutch by the look of her, pale hair gone to silver at the temples, a face that had seen weather, eyes the color of river ice in early thaw. She wore a long gray coat that was too big for her and a dark scarf knotted at her throat, and she carried herself the way some women carry themselves when they have made peace with not being looked at. Bright said she was a healer. Said she'd been working the trading posts for years, knew plants and roots and remedies, could set bones if it came to it. He said he had no more use for her services, and she had no more place at the post. The way he said it told me something about what her place had actually been. One of my warriors, a young man named Chask, asked if she was to be traded. I said no. Bright tried to smile. I looked at him until the smile was gone. She stayed 3 days because one of our women was sick and Sira knew the plant. She stayed a 4th day because the snow came. And then it was spring and she was still there. Nobody asked her to leave, and she never spoke about leaving. She built herself into the camp the way water builds itself into rock, slowly, filling in the shapes that needed filling, not asking permission. She learned 6 words of Lakota the first week and 40 by the 2nd month. She made a poultice from cottonwood bark and sage for a boy whose arm had gone wrong after a fall, and she sat with him through the night it turned bad and held his hand and talked to him in German, which he didn't understand, but which seemed to help him anyway. She traded her mending for food, her remedies for small kindnesses. She never asked for protection. She never made herself less than she was. I watched her from the right distance for a long time. I have to tell you about the veil before I can tell you what happened. She wore it over her hat on the days when she went outside the camp to gather plants along the creek, to meet traders who sometimes came. A widow's veil, black and plain, draped so it covered her face when she pulled it down. I thought nothing of it at first. White women wore them. It was a custom I didn't share but respected. But she wore it at other times too, when strangers entered camp, when raised voices came from across the fire. Once, when one of the young men threw a rope hard at a post and the crack of it was sharp and sudden, I saw her pull the veil down from the brim of her hat and hold it there with one hand, not even seeming to know she'd done it. She put something between herself and the world. That was what she did, a layer. Something to look through, something to be looked at rather than looked into. I recognized that. The form was different, mine was silence. She used cloth, but the habit was the same. You stop letting the world have your face. You give it a surface and keep the rest for yourself. I didn't say anything about it for a long time. The first time we talked, really talked, not just words passing between us, was over a horse. One of my best mares had gone lame in her left foreleg, and I was sitting with her at dawn trying to feel what was wrong, running my hand down the leg, and Sierra came around the edge of the corral and stood watching. I looked up. She held up a hand, not a greeting exactly, more like she was asking permission to look. I nodded. She came in slow, spoke to the mare quietly in German the way she'd spoken to that boy. Knelt down. Her fingers found the place in the tendon faster than mine had, and she pressed 2 spots apart from each other, and the mare shifted her weight, and Sierra looked up at me and said, "Swelling between the joints, 3 days rest and cold water wraps, she'll be fine." I said, "You know horses." She said, "I know pain. Horses and people, it looks the same. Something in them braces around it. You can feel the bracing." I sat with that for a moment, then I said, "I've seen you brace." She went very still, not the stillness of fear, I've seen that enough to know it, the stillness of someone deciding whether to open a door. She said, "Most people don't notice." I said, "I notice." She looked at me for a long time, then she stood up and walked back to camp. The mare nuzzled my shoulder. I stayed there until the sun was clear of the ridge. That was in the early spring. What happened between spring and summer was this. We learned each other in the way 2 people learn each other when neither one is in a hurry and both have enough scar tissue to be careful. We ate across the fire from each other. We walked the creek in the evening sometimes, not always speaking. She told me about plants. I told her about the land, how it moved, how to read weather in the color of the grass. Once she translated something a passing white man said to me that was meant to be insulting, and she translated it plain, without softening it, and looked me in the eye after and said, "He's a fool." I respected that. She laughed once, at something I said about a crow who had stolen 3 consecutive mornings of Chask's breakfast. It was a good laugh, genuine, over before she seemed to want it to be, like she'd let something slip and wasn't sure she should have. She put a hand over her mouth after, not quite smiling anymore. I thought, "You haven't laughed in a long time either." The summer brought trouble the way summer often does. A band of men, not soldiers, worse than soldiers in some ways, moving through the valley below our camp. They'd burned a homestead 2 days east. 4 of them, looking for horses, maybe, or looking for whatever men like that look for when they're moving without fear of consequence. I rode down with 5 of my men to watch them from the ridge. They camped below us, built a fire big enough that you could read their carelessness in it. I came back at dusk, and Sierra was at the edge of camp watching the smoke from the valley. She had the veil down. I said, "They'll move on. It's not our trouble tonight." She said, "It might be someone else's trouble." I said, "Yes." She was quiet. Then she said, low, almost to herself, "I used to tell myself that too, that whatever was happening to me wasn't my trouble yet, that if I just waited it would pass through." I looked at her. She was still watching the smoke. I said, "How long did you wait?" She said, 20 years. I didn't say anything. You don't fill a silence like that with words. You let it be the size it is. After a while she said, "His name was Hale. He was a factor at the trading post. He was not always cruel. That's the part that confuses people when I try to explain it, so I stopped explaining. He wasn't always cruel. He was charming a year out of every 3 and the other years were something else. I kept thinking the good year was the real one. I kept thinking I'd done something to make the other years happen, that if I was careful enough the good year would stay." She stopped. I said, "You didn't do anything." She said, "I know that now. I only knew it when he died. When the fever took him, I waited 2 days to be sure, and then I wept, and I couldn't tell if I was weeping because I'd loved him once or because I was free, and the not knowing which felt like the worst thing he ever did to me." I moved around the fire and sat beside her, not close, just near. She didn't move away. She said, "I came out here because I couldn't be inside anymore. Not rooms, not walls. I needed to be somewhere that was just sky, just ground, somewhere that didn't have his shape in it." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I know you do." Below us, the men by the fire in the valley were laughing at something. The sound came up the ridge, thin and distant. She kept watching. Then she reached up and untied the veil, pulled it off the hat and held it in her hands, looking at it. It was a simple thing, black mesh, faded at one edge. She folded it into a square and put it in her coat pocket. She said, "I don't know why I still carry that." I said, "You got used to having something between you and whatever was coming." She looked at me then, really looked, not the way women look at a chief, not measuring authority or deciding how to approach. Just looked at me, the way you look at someone you've decided is real. She said, "Yes, that's it, that's exactly it." I didn't weep that night. That came later, and I'll tell you how. What happened that night was I saw her face, without anything between it and the firelight. And I understood that she had been hiding something for 20 years, not from strangers but from herself, proof of her own worth, proof that she had survived something that would have broken most people, proof that there was still a woman in there who could choose. And she had kept the veil up so long she'd almost made herself believe there wasn't. I sat with her until the fire burned low. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The weeping happened in August. She had been gathering along the North Creek when she came back to camp, moving wrong, too fast, arms pulled in. I was near the horses and I saw her before she saw me. Her face was white under the weathering of it, and she had her right hand pressed flat to her left forearm. I went to her. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Nothing, it's nothing, I just," and stopped. I took her hand gently and moved it. There was a bruise, new and dark, running from her wrist to the inside of her elbow. She'd fallen, she said. Branch caught her wrong. I looked at her. She held my gaze for 2 seconds, 3, and then her face changed, the way a wall changes when the water finally gets behind it. Not breaking, letting. She said, "I saw one of those men from the valley. He'd come back alone. He was the way he looked at me." She stopped again. Her jaw was tight. I said, "He hurt you?" She said, "He grabbed me. I pulled away. I have a knife. I used it. He ran. I'm all right." I could feel something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not rage. That was underneath it, sure. Above it was something older and simpler. The feeling of a man who has failed to do the one thing a man is supposed to do, which is to keep the harm away. I said, "I should have ridden down and sent those men out of the valley when we saw them." She said, "You couldn't have known." I said, "I should have anyway, not because I knew, because it was right." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Chayton, I need you to hear me. What happened to me in this valley today on that creek with that man, that was nothing compared to 20 years of hail. Do you understand? That man today I handled. I have always been able to handle the sudden thing. It was the slow thing I couldn't handle. It was waking up day after day, next to something that was sometimes kind, and waiting to find out which day it was. She wasn't crying, her voice was steady. She said, "You didn't fail me today. You are the first man in a very long time who has looked at me like I was worth looking at without wanting something back. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing. You should know that." I don't know why those words broke what they broke. I had been carrying something for 6 years and longer than that, the loss of Winona, the loss of the land around us shifting year by year, the slow loneliness of leading people when you yourself have no one to be led back to. I had carried it the way I always carry things, without putting it down, without showing the weight. And she saw it. Without me saying any of it, she saw it the way she'd seen the mare's tendon. I put my face in my hands. I don't know how else to say it. I am not ashamed of it. I sat there in the afternoon light with her bruised arm between my hands and my face bent down, and I wept. Not loudly. Not the way young men weep when they're surprised by it. The quiet kind that comes from down in your chest where you've been keeping it sealed up. She put her hand on the back of my neck, just that. Her palm warm and steady, not trying to stop it or explain it, just "I'm here, I'm not leaving." We stayed like that until it passed. I want to tell you what that cost her, because it wasn't nothing. She had spent 20 years learning not to reach toward a man in pain. She had learned the way you learn things that are beaten into you, that a man in pain turns it outward, turns it toward you, makes you the place it lands. She had built herself around that knowledge, and she reached toward me anyway. That is the thing. That is the part I carry with the most care. She chose to unlearn a fear because she decided I was different. That is a kind of bravery I could not have matched. I know what it cost her, and I know she gave it freely, and those two things together, the cost and the freedom of it, are what made it land the way it did. We moved camp before the first snow. Farther north into the hills. Better forage, better water, less of the army's slow creep in that direction. Sierra packed her things without being asked, and loaded them onto a horse without being told which one. She had made herself part of the band so carefully and so quietly that when we moved, she moved with us the way your shadow moves, not something you organize, just something that is. Chask's wife, a woman named Anpau, told me one evening that Sierra had been teaching the younger girls the name of every plant along the creek in both Lakota and German, and that they thought this was the funniest thing that had ever happened, these two sounds for the same leaf, and that they had started calling her two-name woman, and Sierra had laughed at this and learned to say it herself. I sat by the fire that night thinking about a woman who spent 20 years making herself disappear learning to be called by two names. There was a night in late October when the first real cold came down from the north, the kind that smells like iron and means business. I had built the fire up high and most of the band had gone to sleep, and Sierra came and sat beside me without asking, and I moved slightly to make room for her, and she leaned, not the whole of her weight, just the edge of her shoulder against mine, the way you lean against something you trust to be there. We sat that way for a long time. She said, "Tell me about Winona." Nobody had asked me that in years, not since right after she died, when people were being careful with me. After enough time had passed, they stopped asking because that's what people do. They think the asking is the wound, when really it's the silence that's the wound. I told her, not everything, you can't tell everything, but the shape of it. How Winona had been the only person who could make me feel foolish in a way I didn't mind. How she'd had a laugh that started late, you had to wait for it. How she wore her hair in one braid when she was working, and two when she was feeling fine, and I always watched her hair in the morning to see which day it was going to be. How the morning she dyed her hair was in two braids, and I have never been able to make sense of that. Sierra listened without filling in the spaces. That is rarer than it sounds. She said she sounded like she was magnificent. I said she was. Sierra said, I'm glad you had her. Not, I'm sorry you lost her. Not, she sounds wonderful. I'm glad you had her. The way you'd say it if you meant it from the inside, not the surface. I looked at her. Firelight on her face, her silver-pale hair, her eyes that had been closed against the world for so long and were open now. I said, Sierra. She said, yes. I said, I'm glad you're here. She said, so am I. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I didn't move. I stayed very still the way you stay still when a thing you'd stopped hoping for finally lands. I am going to skip ahead now, not because the in-between doesn't matter, but because a man can only hold so much of his own story in one telling. What I will tell you is this: she stayed. She stayed through that winter and through the one after it. She learned Lakota the way she'd learned the land plant by plant, root by root, until it was in her so deep she dreamed in it. She kept her healer's work. She earned the band's respect not because she asked for it, but because she showed up at the hard moments and did the hard thing and asked for nothing back. What happened between us happened slowly, the way things happen between two people who have both been burned and know better than to rush toward fire. There was a morning in the second spring when I came in from a night ride and she had left food by my fire, kept warm under a flat stone. That was all. That was enough. I understood what she meant by it. There was an evening when she asked me to teach her to read the stars the way my father had taught me, not their names in English but their names in Lakota, the stories they hold. I sat behind her and pointed, and at some point she stopped looking at the sky and turned to look at me, and the distance between us was a decision, and we both made it. The deer hide is still folded the same way she left it. She put it over my shoulders herself on the night of a ceremony in the third year, a ceremony I did not expect, that she had arranged with the elders and the women, that I did not know was coming. A night in late September, cool and clear, the kind of night where the stars are low enough to feel personal. She stood in front of me with the hide beadwork she had done herself, blue and white, months of work I had not seen her do. Somehow she had kept it from me, and she put it over my shoulders with her two hands, and she said in Lakota, careful and clear, the words she had prepared. This man is worth honoring. He held us when we needed holding. He is the reason we stand here. I could not speak. The band was all around us quiet. Chask was behind me. Anpao, the children who called Sierra two-name woman. She stood in front of me with her two hands on the hide at my shoulders and her eyes steady on mine, and she said, I see you, Chayton Eagleheart. I see all of it. I put my hands over hers. That's all I did. I don't have a word for what I felt that is small enough to say out loud. It was the thing I had stopped believing I would feel again, not love exactly, though it was that too, but the thing underneath love, the thing that makes love mean something. To be known. To have someone look at the whole of you and choose to stay. To have your worth seen by someone who has every reason to have given up on worth. I had been chief for 19 years, and in those years I had been many things: brave when I needed to be, steady when I could not afford to be anything else. I had been a husband and a widower and a leader and a man alone. And in that moment, with her hands under mine and her eyes on mine and the whole of the band around us in the September night, I was simply a man who was loved. That is the word for it. Simply that. The deer hide is still folded the same way she left it, bottom corner tucked under, a hand's width of beadwork showing. She is not gone. I want to be clear. She is at the creek now, the way she often is in the morning, gathering whatever the season has put there, talking to the plants in German and Lakota both. I will hear her come back. The sound her steps make on the dry grass, the way she'll push the tippy flap back and say something in Lakota that isn't quite right yet but is getting there. I sit with the hide in my lap sometimes in the early morning before the camp wakes, not out of grief, out of something closer to, I don't have a name for it in English. In Lakota, there's a word, something like the feeling of a good weight that you carry not because you have to, but because you chose it. She carried a veil for 20 years. Not cloth, not always. A habit of hiding. A way of putting something between herself and the world so the world couldn't find her face. And she took it off slowly over many months, the way you take off something that has kept you safe in a storm, carefully, because you're not sure yet that the storm is over but feeling the sun coming through. I was the man she put her hands on when she finally let it go. I don't know if I earned that. I think about it sometimes. But I know I will spend whatever years I have left being the kind of man who deserved the faith she put in me, which is maybe the closest you can get to earning something after the fact. The creek sounds the same as it always has. The smoke is rising from the cook fires. A horse somewhere is moving, the soft sound of hooves on soft ground. In a little while she'll come back, she'll say something, I'll say something back, we'll have the morning. That's enough. That's more than I expected and more than I deserved, and she gave it to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's the kind of woman she is.